listening to the Hey Legal podcast.
CPD, when you want, where you want.
CPD for modern lawyers.
This free Hey Legal podcast is brought to you with the support of Caseload from De Novo Business Intelligence, the only whole practice management software built for modern Scottish law firms. De Novo have successfully provided hundreds of law firms with smart business software solutions that boost the bottom line, improve efficiency, and maintain law society compliance for more than 30 years. You can find and connect with the De Novo team on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
On this episode of the Hey Legal podcast, Donald Findlay is in conversation with Ali Thompson of Hey Legal. Donald chats about his interest with the Peter Manuel trial.
Yes, I've had not an obsession, but I've had an interest that has stuck with me for a long, long time. The whole thing about it, the court, this man charged with so many crimes, the whole thing just grabbed my attention.
Donald also chats about his entry into the world of law.
And we went to Deacon Brodie's and we had a drink or two. And I decided, well, this seems like a perfectly reasonable way of making a living. This will do for me.
And his relationship with his friend, his colleague and his mentor, Joe Beltrami.
A great man. I loved him to bits. He was, as I said at his funeral, he was my mentor. He was my professional colleague, but he was also my friend.
All this and more coming right up.
So, Donald, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We're just going to have a general chat about all matters legal. So, can I take you right back to the start? When did you first show an interest in the law?
It would have been 1958.
Yes. Would that coincide with a particular trial?
That would coincide with the trial of Peter Manuel.
Yes. Something you've had a very long-term interest in.
Yes, I've had not an obsession, but I've had an interest that has stuck with me for a long, long time.
So, if you don't mind me asking, what age were you at that time?
Well, I was born in March of 1951, so I was 6 or 7 when the Manuel trial was on the go. And that was one of two things that created my interest in the law. The other was a television programme called Boyd QC, where the late Michael Dennison played an English Queen's Counsel, who was always on the side of the underdog and was never part of the establishment. And that appealed to me. So those were the two things that drew me to the law.
Yeah. So how were you picking up information about...
Well, in those days, a case such as the Manuel trial was reported almost word for word in the newspapers. I mean, there were pages and pages on the Manuel trial. Unlike today, where a big trial, you might get a couple of columns, but everything was reported, so you could follow it. Yeah. Follow it in some detail.
And what aspect of it was it that captivated you?
I don't know. Just the whole thing about it. It was the court. This man charged with so many crimes. Just the whole thing just grabbed my attention. I couldn't actually say it was because of any particular aspect. It was perhaps because I was able to follow it. It was also to some extent because I've always been awkward. I wouldn't deny that. Because everybody thought it was appalling that a child should be taking an interest in the trial of a mass murder. To the extent that we used to have a sort of an aunt. Well, she wasn't an aunt. She was a friend of the family, but she was known as Auntie, and I can't even remember the poor old dear's name. But she arrived one day to visit my grandmother, and she said at one point, "What was the child's reading?" So my father said it was about the Manuel trial in Glasgow, and she fainted. Or affected to faint.
Yes.
2 glasses of the cooking sherry revived her fairly quickly. So that kind of thing appealed to me.
Yes. And were you struck in any way, as I understand it, he represented himself?
For much of the trial, he represented himself. He started off being represented by Hal Leslie, who went on to become Lord Bursey, the chairman of the Scottish Land Court. And Bertie Grieve was the second senior counsel. And, of course, the junior was Malcolm Morrison, who went on to become Tiger Morrison and a judge.
Yes.
And eventually Manuel sacked all three of them. And then Dean of Faculty, who was Jim Shaw, Lord Kilbrandon, came through and offered himself, and Manuel said, no, you can do one as well. And he then proceeded to conduct his own defence. Not assisted by Jock Cameron was the judge, because that's not the way it was. But a trial judge, if there is someone defending themselves, will do their best to keep them on the straight and narrow. But it's not the trial judge's job to conduct the defence for them. And at times, Manuel did very well and made some very good points. He also made some terrible, terrible mistakes. But then he'd made a lot of mistakes before he got to that stage in the trial.
So. Very much so. And the outcome was obviously his hanging.
He was convicted of a number of murders. There was an appeal of sorts. He was going to hang, so everybody appealed in those days. The appeal didn't take long, but this time he was represented by R.H. MacDonald, who became Lord MacDonald in due course, and Malcolm Morrison, who was the only one who stayed the course, and then he was hanged.
And do you have any thoughts on the death penalty?
Now, I'm totally against the death penalty. When I was younger, I took the view that there were some crimes that were so horrendous that you deserve. Why should we keep people alive for doing what they did? But I suppose the more I got into the law and the more I discovered about people who were hanged who shouldn't have been, that makes an impact on me. And I really came to the view that it was, firstly, too dangerous to have a death penalty. But also in the wider context, I really came to the view that a civilized country doesn't kill its own citizens. So I would be anti the death penalty. And it's academic, it's not going to come back.
Yes, of course.
Unless we all move to Texas.
Keep the conversation going by following our guest on Twitter or by connecting on LinkedIn.
You said you were always awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Were you awkward at school?
Yes. I've never been very good with authority.
Okay.
If somebody tells me to do something that I don't agree with, I won't do it. Or I will go out of my way not to do it.
Yes.
Or to do it in a way that is different from the way it's supposed to be done. I've always had a problem with authority. And
has that played out in your career, do you think?
I think if you ask authority, they would say absolutely, yes.
And in terms of academia, so were you very bright at school?
I didn't find school particularly difficult. I didn't actually find university terribly difficult either.
Yes.
I remember somebody did once say to me that if I had worked harder at school and at university, had I ever contemplated what I might have achieved? Well, I didn't really need to. So
yes.
There we are.
Yeah. And how did you make your entrance into the world of law then?
I'd like to say it was a flourish, but like everybody else did, through the back door.
Okay.
When I was at university, one of the lecturers arranged for me to come through to Edinburgh from Dundee to meet a couple of advocates that he knew. And they showed me around. And we went to Deacon Brodie's. And we had a drink or two. And I decided, well, this seems like a perfectly reasonable way of making a living. This will do for me.
Uh-huh.
But the bar was something I'd always wanted to do. When I was at school, the attempt was made to steer me towards medicine, because that was the direction that the medicine in St Andrews University was kind of what the school sent its, in inverted commas, brighter pupils to. Then we had a physics master who came to the school, and he hated me only marginally less than I hated him. And we fell out totally. And that was an end of my interest in science.
Right.
So I returned to the law. Not that I'd actually been in the law to leave it, but I returned to it.
Yeah. So you went to the bar. And
1975.
And how did you feel when you started to operate in courts? Bend people?
Oh, God, it's so long ago. Well, you start off by, in those far-flung days, doing undefended divorces. And that was what we did, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. And it was great fun.
Yep.
because the Parliament House in those days was alive. I mean, there were hundreds of people going around Parliament House, people running in all directions. It was a great place to be, a real sense of life about it. And the thing about doing divorces was that there was a simple rule. If people came to Edinburgh for a divorce, they got the divorce. And if they didn't, all hell let loose from the solicitor's firm who instructed it. Alan McDougall, who I did my apprenticeship with and so on, and the late, great Bill Laird, that was the mantra. You got a divorce. And if you didn't, it went on for hours, the post-mortem into that.
Okay.
He even arrived at Parliament House one day and was kicking off because the pursuer's father was lying on his back in a waiting room, waiting on the ambulance coming, because he seemed to have had a heart attack. And Bill was furious that we hadn't got him into court to give his evidence. Well, it's a good training.
Yes, that was your training. And how did you make the move into criminal matters?
Your turn, in a sense. When I started off at the bar, doing crime was something that you were almost obliged to do before you got on with the serious part of your practice, which was the civil law.
Okay.
So fairly quickly, you were just given crime to do because, well, it was just there. Somebody had to do
Somebody
it.
had to do it.
Well, when I began to get crime to do, of course, that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And eventually, I met a man called Joe Beltrami.
Very famous, Mr. Beltrami. And that, you thereafter had a blossoming relationship with him and a flow of work from him?
Joe and I worked together for 30 years, something like that. A great man. I loved him to bits. He was, as I said at his funeral, he was my mentor. He was my professional colleague, but he was also my friend.
Yeah.
He and another great influence on me was in those days there were solicitors in various towns who did crime, and in Dundee it was a man called John Bose, and Dumfries it was a man called Bill O'Brien. Joe was the man in Glasgow, and they all played a part because they were all very loyal, very supportive, and helped me build up the career. But especially Joe.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things that we got on in a very strange way. And it would be hard to describe what the friendship was, but yeah, it was quite special.
So a solicitor-counsel relationship, much
yes,
more than...
it was a very close friendship within the confines of being a solicitor-counsel. If we went out for a meal, it was to discuss the case.
Yes.
Or because Joe had decided it was a good idea, we would go out and discuss the case.
Yes.
And Joe used to phone me up on a Saturday morning, if we weren't actually consulting, just to tell me he'd been thinking about a case. And I said, well, thank you very much, Joe. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. You know?
Yeah, but he was immersed in his work.
Totally. He was. Yeah. He thought about, the only thing Joe thought about other than the law was bowling. And that was something I could not get enthusiastic about.
Okay.
And the only other subject was a football team in the East End of Glasgow, and that had even less interest for me. But he used to, why he had to tell me in the first place that Celtic were the first club to win the European Cup, first British team to win, and then every other week tell me the same thing as if I might have forgotten it. I never quite worked that out, but I loved him for it.
And so you two were equally immersed in your cases.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you buy them?
You could be. Joe believed in his client's innocence, and that was that. And we developed a very practical system over the years that if the client was acquitted, Joe got the credit. If the client was convicted, I took the blame. And we made it work. And he seemed to be quite happy with it.
Sounds a very good arrangement from a perspective. And so these instructions that flowed from the various towns to you would thereafter mean you were inevitably involved in some of the most high-profile cases of the time, even in your relatively early career.
Yes, because, again, you have to understand what it was, how it was back in the 70s and into the 80s. People who did crime were looked down on by many of our professional colleagues, not just in terms of judges and sheriffs and advocates, but solicitors too, which criminal chaps. Yep. And that's how it was. And I started doing crime and then ended up doing a lot of crime. And when it came to murders, it was always senior counsel who was instructed for a murder. And senior counsel would come through who really didn't do crime.
Yes.
And there were one or two solicitors like Joe and another now retired Glasgow solicitor, Des Finnison, who was a very prominent solicitor of his day.
Yes.
And Des was one of the first. And I remember him coming to me about a case where he had a senior who had pulled out. And he said, I want you to do it. I said, well, I can't because I'm doing something else. He said, I don't mean as junior, I mean as senior.
Yes.
And the establishment wasn't terribly pleased about that either, but that was the way it was.
Yes. And how did you get around that? Were you able to act as senior in the trial?
I just got on with it.
Just
did it. And if people didn't like it, then that wasn't my concern.
Yes. Mr. Findlay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for listening to this Hey Legal podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. To hear the full CPD qualifying content, please visit heylegal.co.uk to subscribe and join our community. Or you could ask your law firm to contact us for a firm-wide subscription. Learn more, be more with Hey Legal.